Midnight Secrets in the Estate. Chapter 1. The Spark. Emily Harrington stood at the edge of the ballroom, her gloved fingers nervously tracing the embroidery on her muslin gown. The soft candlelight reflected off the towering chandeliers, casting a golden glow over the sea of finely dressed guests. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and perfume, mingling with the faint aroma of champagne and spiced cakes. Laughter and music swirled together in a harmonious din, but Emily barely registered any of it. Her gaze was fixed across the room, where James Whitmore, the eldest son of the Earl of Blackwood, stood surrounded by eager admirers. James was everything she had been warned against: charming, reckless, and utterly unsuitable for a young woman of her standing. His reputation preceded him, whispered in scandalous tones behind fluttering fans. He was a known rake, a man who played with hearts as carelessly as he played cards at the gentlemen's club. And yet, when their eyes met, the noise of the ballroom seemed to dim, and the space between them felt charged with something unspoken. With a graceful ease that seemed almost deliberate, James extricated himself from his circle of admirers and strode toward her. The confidence in his step, the slight quirk of his lips, it all made Emily's heart pound against the confines of her corset. He was impeccably dressed, his dark blue coat tailored to perfection, his cravat tied with studied carelessness. His riding boots gleamed as if he had just stepped out of a portrait. "Miss Harrington," he said smoothly, executing a perfect bow, "may I have the honor of this dance?" Emily hesitated, her pulse fluttering like a trapped bird. She knew the risks of dancing with a man like James. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. A lady must guard her reputation, Emily. But another voice, one that belonged solely to her, whispered of adventure, of defiance, of the sheer thrill of stepping into the unknown. A slow smile curved her lips. "It would be my pleasure, Mr. Whitmore." His fingers, warm even through the fabric of her gloves, closed over hers as he led her onto the dance floor. The first strains of a waltz filled the room, and as they moved in time to the music, Emily felt a thrill rush through her. His touch at her waist was firm, yet tantalizingly gentle, his breath close enough to send shivers down her spine. Their steps were flawless, each movement drawing them closer, pushing the boundaries of propriety ever so slightly. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of intrigue and scandal, brewing beneath the glittering chandeliers. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes upon them, but she no longer cared. In James's arms, beneath the gaze of London's high society, she felt something she never had before. She felt alive. As the dance neared its end, James's hand lingered just a moment too long at her waist, his thumb brushing over the fabric in a fleeting, intimate caress. Emily's breath hitched, her mind a whirlwind of sensation and uncertainty. What was she doing? And why did it feel so intoxicatingly right? James leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do hope this will not be our only dance." Emily met his gaze, her resolve wavering. The rational part of her knew she should step away, offer only a polite nod, and retreat into the safety of decorum. But the reckless part, the part that had always longed for something more than needlework and afternoon teas, answered before she could stop herself. "That depends, Mr. Whitmore," she murmured, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "Are you always this bold?" A glint of mischief flickered in his eyes. "Only when I meet someone worth the risk." As the next dance began and another gentleman stepped forward to claim her hand, James took a step back, offering a parting bow. But his gaze remained locked with hers, a silent promise lingering in the space between them. Emily exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her racing heart. The spark had been ignited, and something told her that this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Suitor. Lord Ashford watched the pair from the shadows, his sharp eyes narrowing. The candlelight cast long, flickering shapes across the marble floor, but his focus was on Emily and James. Every glance they exchanged, every whispered word, deepened the fire simmering in his chest. He had been courting Emily for months, dutifully, properly, with the full approval of her family. Though she had yet to accept his proposal, he considered her as good as his. The sight of her laughing with James Whitmore, reckless, insufferable James, was an insult he could not ignore. Ashford's jaw clenched as he took a slow sip of his brandy, the amber liquid burning down his throat. It should have been him making her smile like that. He had done everything right. He was titled wealthy, respectable. And yet, with a single look, James had unraveled everything he had worked for. As the evening wore on, Ashford kept his distance, though his mind was already scheming. If Emily thought she had a choice in the matter, she was mistaken. Later that evening, Emily retreated to the quiet of her chamber, her heart still fluttering from the intoxicating thrill of the dance. She removed the pearl combs from her hair, allowing loose curls to cascade over her shoulders, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But just as she reached for the ribbon of her gown, a crisp envelope caught her eye, slipped beneath her door. She hesitated before bending down to retrieve it. The paper was smooth beneath her fingers, the wax seal broken. Her maid, Mary, must have delivered it in secret. Tearing it open, Emily scanned the words scrawled across the page in a bold, familiar hand. My dearest Emily, I cannot pretend any longer. I will not stand by while others decide your future for you. Say the word, and I will take you away from all of this. We will forge a new path, free from expectation, free from the weight of duty. Tell me you feel it too, and I will be yours. James. Emily's breath caught. She pressed the letter to her chest, her pulse racing. The words were dangerous, reckless, everything James was. And yet, for the first time in her life, she felt the spark of something greater than duty. A sudden knock on the door shattered the moment. She scrambled to hide the letter in the folds of her gown, just as her mother's voice rang through the wood. Emily, Lady Harrington called, Lord Ashford is here to see you. Emily's fingers tightened around the delicate paper as her heart pounded. The walls of her world were closing in. Chapter 3. The Scandal. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of stolen moments and secret letters, a delicate dance between desire and danger. Emily and James met wherever they could, a fleeting touch in the library, whispered confessions in the moonlit gardens, a lingering glance in a hidden alcove of the manor. Each meeting was a risk, but neither could resist the pull between them. James was reckless, but Emily found herself craving his recklessness. He spoke of running away, of leaving behind the rigid expectations of society, of a life where they could be free. And though Emily knew the impossibility of such dreams, she let herself believe in them, if only for a moment. But fate was not kind to lovers who defied the rules. One fateful evening, their luck ran out. The library was dimly lit, the flickering light from the fireplace casting long shadows across the shelves. James had arrived first, waiting in the quiet hush of the room, his heart pounding in anticipation. When Emily finally stepped inside, her golden curls tumbling over her shoulders, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. You shouldn't have come, she whispered, though she made no move to step away when he reached for her hand. And yet, here you are, he murmured, his fingers brushing against hers. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the way his touch sent heat coursing through her. He reached up, tucking a loose curl behind her ear, his thumb grazing the soft skin of her cheek. Their faces were close, too close. It was then that a sharp gasp cut through the stillness. Emily spun around, her heart plummeting as she saw a maid standing in the doorway, eyes wide with shock. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Then, with a swirl of skirts, the maid fled. Emily's breath came fast. James! I'll handle it, he said, already moving toward the door, but it was too late. By morning, the entire household was abuzz with whispers. Servants exchanged knowing glances, ladies covered their mouths with delicate fans, and the rumors spread like wildfire. By afternoon, Lord Ashford came calling. Emily was seated in the drawing room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but inside, her thoughts churned. She had known this moment would come, but not so soon. When the door opened and Lord Ashford strode in, she braced herself. There was no warmth in his expression. Gone was the suitor who had once courted her with practiced charm. In his place stood a man who had been scorned, and who would not be made a fool of. He did not bother with pleasantries. Instead, he leaned down, his voice low, cold. "Marry me," he demanded, his eyes dark with calculation, "or I will ensure that your reputation is ruined. James will be forced to honor his betrothal to Lady Beatrice, and you will be left with nothing." Emily's fingers tightened around the fabric of her gown. Her world had just collapsed around her. Chapter 4. The Separation. The morning James was sent away, the sky was dark with the promise of rain. He stood by the carriage, fists clenched at his sides, his jaw set in defiance, as his father, the Earl of Blackwood, delivered his final decree. "You will leave for London at once," the Earl commanded. "Lady Beatrice is expecting you, and I will not tolerate any further disgrace." James's eyes burned with fury. "You think sending me away will change how I feel?" His father's expression remained unmoved. "I think distance will remind you of your duty. You are my heir, James. I will not allow you to throw away everything for a foolish infatuation." James turned toward the estate one last time, his heart aching at the thought of Emily locked away inside, forced to endure the wrath of her own family. He wanted to fight, to storm back inside and take her away, but the carriage door swung open and the footman waited. There was nothing he could do, yet. With one last look at Blackwood Manor, James climbed inside, the wheels rumbling to life beneath him. As the carriage pulled away, his fingers curled around a folded letter hidden in his coat. He would not give up. No matter what it took, he would find a way back to her. Emily sat by her bedroom window, her hands trembling as she clutched the letter Mary had smuggled to her, beneath the folds of a linen napkin. The ink was smudged in places, as if James had written in haste, and her heart pounded as she read his words. "My love, they have torn me from you, but they cannot break what we share. No force in this world will keep me from you. I swear it. Hold on to hope. I will find a way." Tears welled in her eyes. She pressed the letter to her lips, desperate to believe his promise. But with every hour that passed, her world felt smaller. Her mother and father took turns visiting her chamber, each conversation more insistent than the last. "You have no choice, Emily," her mother pleaded. "Your reputation is already in question. Lord Ashford is willing to overlook it. Do you not see what a gift that is?" Her father was less gentle. "You will marry Lord Ashford, and you will do it before the month is out. We have suffered enough disgrace." Emily refused to answer, staring out the window as rain began to fall. She could not bring herself to speak the words they wanted to hear. She would not marry Lord Ashford, not while James still fought for her. But time was slipping away. Chapter 5. The Reunion. The storm rolled in just as the clock struck midnight. Rain lashed against the manor's stone walls, the wind howling through the trees like a warning. Inside, Emily sat at the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding with the weight of uncertainty. She had tried to steel herself against hope, tried to silence the desperate longing in her heart, but she had failed. A sudden rustling at the window sent her pulse into a frenzy. She turned just in time to see a shadow move beyond the glass. Then, a familiar knock, soft but insistent. James. Tearing across the room, she flung the window open. He was there, drenched from the rain, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his cravat loosened as if he had ridden through the storm without a thought to his appearance. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, but his eyes, those stormy blue eyes, were steady, determined. "Emily," he said, his voice rough, urgent, "come with me." Her breath hitched. "James, you—" "I won't lose you," he cut in, reaching for her hand. His fingers were ice cold, but his grip was firm. "I defied my father, left everything behind. I'll never go back, not without you. We'll leave tonight, Scotland. We can be wed by morning." A lump formed in her throat. She had dreamed of this moment. But now that it was here, the weight of it threatened to crush her. To leave meant severing ties with her family forever. It meant scandal, exile, and an uncertain future. But the alternative, life without him, was unbearable. She looked into his eyes, searching for certainty, and found it there, unwavering. a man who had risked everything for her, a love worth risking everything for. Her hesitation melted away. She nodded. Take me with you. Relief crashed over James like a wave. Without another word, he helped her down from the window, catching her in his arms as her feet touched the damp earth. The storm raged around them as they ran, hand in hand through the garden and beyond the estate walls. The world they had known was behind them now, fading with every desperate step. Ahead, the road stretched into darkness, into freedom, into forever. Chapter 6. The Escape. The night was a blur of wind and rain as James and Emily rode hard toward the northern border. Their stolen horse galloped through the muddy roads, hooves pounding against the earth, in a frantic rhythm that matched the thundering of their hearts. Emily clung to James, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, the cold night air whipping against her soaked gown. We're almost there, love, James shouted over the storm, though his voice was laced with urgency. They both knew the truth. Lord Ashford and the Earl of Blackwood would not let them go so easily. Indeed, not long after their escape, word had spread. Ashford had sent men after them, and James's father, furious at his son's defiance, had done the same. By now, they were being hunted. At a crossroads, James slowed the horse and turned to Emily. Rain dripped from the loose strands of her hair, her lips trembling from the cold. He cupped her face gently. We need to stop for the night. If we push the horse any further, we'll risk injury. Emily nodded, trusting him completely. They rode on until they found refuge in a small, dimly lit inn nestled at the edge of a quiet village. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with a knowing smile, took one look at them, disheveled, drenched, desperate, and ushered them inside without question. You'll want a room far from the entrance, she said, leading them upstairs. No one will bother you here. Inside the tiny room, a single candle flickered on the wooden bedside table. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting a warm glow that did little to dry their clothes, but eased the chill from their bones. Emily turned to James, her heart hammering. They had shared stolen moments before, glances across crowded rooms, touches hidden behind closed doors, but never had they been truly alone like this. James stepped closer, his fingers grazing her damp sleeve. I meant what I said, he murmured. I'll never go back without you. She reached for him then, her hands trembling as she traced the sharp angles of his jaw, memorizing the face of the man who had risked everything for her. The weight of the world had been pressing on them for so long, but in that moment there was only love. No titles, no obligations, no fear. As he pulled her into his arms, Emily surrendered to the fire that had burned between them from the very beginning. By dawn, they were on the road again. The sky blushed with the first light of morning as they crossed into Scotland, their exhaustion drowned by the exhilaration of what lay ahead. When they arrived at Gretna Green, the blacksmith's forge stood as a beacon of hope. The anvil, the very symbol of love forged in defiance of the world, waited for them. The ceremony was simple, witnessed only by the blacksmith and his wife. But the moment James slid the ring onto Emily's finger, everything else faded away. I, James Whitmore, take you, Emily Harrington, to be my wife, he vowed, his voice steady despite the storm still raging in their wake. Emily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. And I, Emily Harrington, take you, James Whitmore, to be my husband. With those words, they became bound to each other, against all odds, against all obstacles. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. The news of their elopement spread like wildfire. By the time James and Emily returned to England, the scandal had reached every drawing room from London to the countryside. The Earl of Blackwood's fury knew no bounds. His heir, his carefully groomed son, had thrown away everything for love. You are no longer my son, the Earl had spat when James dared to face him. You have disgraced this family beyond repair. James stood tall, Emily's hand firmly in his. If love is a disgrace, then I wear it proudly. The Earl's decision was swift and merciless. James was disinherited, cut off from his inheritance, his name spoken in their family home only as a cautionary tale. The privileges of his birth, his wealth, his title, his lands, were gone. But he had Emily. Lord Ashford, however, was not so easily silenced. The humiliation of losing Emily, of being denied what he had seen as his by right, turned his rejection into a thirst for vengeance. He used his influence to tarnish James's name further, ensuring doors that had once been open to him were slammed shut. Yet despite it all, James and Emily stood together, unshaken. The years that followed were not without hardship. They built their life from nothing, relying only on their love and James's determination to provide for them. He found work as a horse breeder, his skill with animals earning him respect in the quiet countryside where they had settled. Emily, once accustomed to silks and ballroom gowns, learned the joys of a simple life, kneading bread in the morning, reading by candlelight in the evenings, and raising their children with boundless love. Their modest home was nothing like the grand estates they had left behind, but within its walls was a warmth and happiness that no wealth or title could have ever provided. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the golden leaves drifted lazily from the trees, Emily stood in the doorway of their cottage, watching their children play in the garden. Their eldest son, with his father's striking blue eyes, chased his sister through the wildflowers, their laughter ringing through the air. James stepped up behind Emily, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned into him, sighing contentedly. "We did it, James," she whispered. "We found our happily ever after." He pressed a kiss to the side of her head, his heart swelling with gratitude, and it was worth every moment of the struggle. As he held her close, watching the life they had built unfold before them, James knew that he had never been richer. For in the end, love had been the only fortune worth fighting for. Epilogue. The years passed, and the world changed, but the legend of James and Emily Whitmore lived on. Their names, once whispered in scandal, became synonymous with a love so powerful that it transcended the expectations of their time. It was a story passed down from generation to generation, told around firesides and in drawing rooms, to young lovers with stars in their eyes and hearts full of dreams. In every tale, their defiance was celebrated, their refusal to bow to societal pressures, to sacrifice their happiness for titles and wealth. It became the cornerstone of the many stories that followed, of lovers who broke free from the shackles of convention to carve their own path, of souls who knew, like James and Emily, that love was the only thing worth fighting for. Their love was immortalized in songs, in poetry, and in the hearts of those who had never known them, but felt their passion echo through the ages. Couples who found themselves torn by the expectations of family and society would often find solace in their story. They would tell themselves, as Emily had once whispered to James, "Love is worth more than anything else." And so they too would risk it all. As for James and Emily, they lived the quiet life they had chosen, watching their children grow, their legacy blossoming in the next generation. Their love was no longer something to be hidden or fought for. It was the foundation of everything they had built. And yet, in the stillness of the night, when the house was empty and the world slept, they would find each other. Under the canopy of stars, with the moon high above them, they would hold each other close. In those moments, the rest of the world faded away. The struggles, the sacrifices, the battles fought and won. None of that mattered in the quiet peace of their embrace. All that mattered was that they had loved each other with a depth and a fierceness that could never be extinguished. And when the wind rustled through the trees or the leaves stirred in the garden, it was as if their whispers could still be heard, carried through time. We did it. We found our forever. It was a love that had been tested, had withstood the trials of life and the weight of the world's expectations. And even when they were gone, their story would live on, a testament to the enduring power of love, a love that refused to be silenced,